stack.
At the end of the first millennium, around 1000 AD, China was definitively the most powerful country in the world. More than a third of the world lived within its borders, its technology was the most advanced in existence, and its economy accounted for an astronomical 50% of the world's GDP. The West paled in comparison to China. But eventually, Europe arose from its dark ages, the importance of China diminished, and the West came to rule the world. Today that is still largely the case, but China is rising again. In 1978, China had a GDP of only $200 billion, only about 4% of the world's GDP. But nowadays, that GDP has risen to $11 trillion and accounts for 15% of all economic activity in the world. This economic renaissance of the last 40 years is largely thanks to one industry: manufacturing. We've come to accept that China is the world's factory, but it wasn't always this way. In the early 20th century, goods were often just produced right where they were sold. America made American goods, Europe made European goods. It wasn't until cheap worldwide shipping became available that the production side of a company could be relocated to the other side of the world. But why did China win? How did this country become the manufacturing giant it is today? In 1978, Deng Xiaoping took power in the People's Republic of China. He quickly visited Bangkok, Singapore, and other flourishing Asian cities and was convinced that, in order to succeed, China needed to open itself up to the outside world, at least to an extent. He gave people control of their farms, privatized business, and most importantly, allowed foreign investment in the country for the first time in decades. He opened up 4 special economic zones with tax incentives and exemption from the oversight that the rest of the country saw on its investments and trade activity. These 4 zones were essentially the free market portions of China. But none was more successful than this one, Shenzhen in the Guangdong province, so I went there to see what it was like. Before its designation as a special economic zone in 1980, Shenzhen was a tiny town with about 30,000 inhabitants. But today, that's grown to nearly 18 million people. That means that its size rivals that of New York and London. It's believed that Shenzhen might have been the single fastest growing city in human history. Every other special economic zone was an established area before its designation. But Shenzhen made sense as a spot where China could embrace the West as it lay just north of the border of Hong Kong, what was at the time a British territory. Today, Shenzhen is the electronics manufacturing capital of the world.
So Shenzhen as a city is really known for 2 things. One is its manufacturing capabilities, especially for consumer electronics products. And second, its gravitation for talents or human resources, especially on the product development and research and development disciplines.
Apple, Samsung, Microsoft, Sony, Canon, they all manufacture products here in Shenzhen. In fact, 90% of the world's electronics are made at least in part in this city. Everything just costs less in China, so labor costs less too. Where a factory in the United States might pay upwards of $10 to $15 an hour, a Chinese laborer would happily accept $3 or $4 an hour in Shenzhen. When I was there, I withdrew the equivalent of $80 from an ATM upon arrival and left 4 days later with cash left over. A 30-minute taxi ride cost about $7 US. A full meal at a local place was about $3. But China isn't cheap entirely naturally. China has artificially depressed the value of their currency. Up until 2005, the Chinese government just said that the exchange rate was 8.27 won per dollar, and that was that. They then went a few years allowing it to increase in value within a margin, but in 2008 they pegged its value again to make Chinese exports more attractive during the financial crisis. Nowadays the government just picks an exchange rate daily and lets the currency fluctuate from it by up to 2%. This just makes it so Western companies can buy more for less. China also doesn't charge taxes on exports, while the US doesn't charge taxes on imports. The US doesn't even charge customs fees for some products like tablet PCs, so some products can make it all the way from their factory in China to stores in the US completely tax-free. When I was in Shenzhen, I visited a company called Anker. They make all sorts of consumer electronics, but chances are if you have something from them, it's one of their portable batteries. I asked their CEO why so many electronic companies are now based in Shenzhen.
So the advantage is that we're close to the supply chain, so everything is faster, right? So instead of you do a mock-up and see it like 2 weeks later, Here, actually, you send them, design to mock-up, and you receive it like 3 days later.
And moving elsewhere. Manufacturing lines that can be automated are likely to move back to the United States and the rest of the Western market. Robots cost the same whether they're in the United States or China, so manufacturing products in the US helps save on shipping costs and certainly is good for PR. At the same time, the labor-intensive jobs that China prospered on in the past decades are moving to less developed and less expensive countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and India. Chinese manufacturing firms are responding to this by opening up their own factories all across the world, everywhere from Africa to the United States itself. The model that might work for China in the future is that of Anchor, Chinese-based firms that can take advantage of their proximity to the production lines to cut down on development cost and time. Shenzhen-based startups like Anchor, DJI, and OnePlus have already succeeded in taking advantage of this proximity.